So we're in the of this series entitled One Big Story that is in the course of the summer. Here is the ground we've covered so far. We started of creation and how the whole Bible is really telling that story and onward. And the key is, so far, what we've done in the series is told you the big ideas or the big themes from the history of the Old Testament. And with last week's message, we really finished the history of the Old Testament. You go from creation to Abraham and his family, then the creation of the nation of Israel through a period of the Judges, to the giving of kings to Israel, and then really the Old Testament finishes with something that would be like a second Exodus called the exile. However, the reason we're not done with the series yet is this little fact up on the screen. There are 39 books in your Old Testament. Only 17 of them are history books. So we actually have the majority of the Old Testament that we have not talked about yet in this series. And the majority of those books are non-historical books, meaning they're not meant to tell you history. They fall into three big categories. There is the book of Psalms that is in focus today, and then the last 2 weeks of the series are going to focus on the other two kinds of books you find in the Old Testament, the wisdom literature, and then a set of books that is very large called the prophets, the major and the minor prophets. And today, it is our great privilege to hear from somebody else who 6 months ago said they were interested in joining our church's teaching team, and she has been diligently working on the subject of this morning's message, the Psalms, because it's very close to her heart. So would you welcome Maria Kelly, and then she's going to teach us this morning about the Psalms.
Well, thank you, PC, for that introduction. Thank you. Before I begin with talking about Psalms, I want to share where my heart and mind is this morning, and I'd like to quote Paul the Apostle when he was standing before the people in Corinth. And these are his words, because this pretty much is where I am right now. I come to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and preaching are not with wise and persuasive words, but I pray by the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on my wisdom, but on God's power. That's really my hope and prayer this morning, that the words that God has given to me to share this morning will minister to you and encourage you and strengthen your walk in faith. As Pastor Chris just said, the book of Psalms is unique from anything and everything that we've covered thus far. It is actually a collection of about 150 individual songs and poems, in which each stands alone, so there's no chapters. Each is an individual story and source of teaching. The Psalms are a pattern in the Old Testament, where Psalms were a pattern of prayer and worship. I wanted you to keep in mind those two words, prayer and worship. And they were used by the nation of Israel for their prayer and worship. In fact, the Hebrew meaning of Psalms is telahim, which means praises. And we've done a lot of that this morning already. The Psalms were written anywhere between 1440 BC and 586 BC. And it is the longest book in our Bible. There's actually, within the book of Psalms, 5 different types of Psalms. There are Psalms of praises that we heard this morning, and they talk about God, the Creator, Sustainer, and Redeemer. There's prophetic Psalms, which are the messianic prophecies. They are prophesying the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. There's psalms of remembrance of how God has moved in the history of Israel. There's psalms of repentance and God's mercy and forgiveness. And lastly, there are psalms of lamenting, of crying out to God about the injustice and evil in this world. The book of Psalms is the one that we're most familiar with and that we're focusing on this morning. But there are actually psalms in several other Old Testament books. For example, Job, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, which is one of the prophetic books, 1 Samuel, and then Lamentations. There are several authors that wrote the Psalms, not just David is the one we're most familiar with, and he wrote 72 of the Psalms. So what's the purpose of Psalms? Every book in the Bible has a purpose, and so we're going to look at what is the purpose of Psalms. Well, in the Old Testament, Psalms were used for several reasons. First of all, they were used to try to remember and teach the history of how God has been involved in the nation of Israel through all those ages. And so they were very often used actually to teach the generation to come. There's an example of this in Exodus 15, and it says, Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The Lord is my strength and my song, for he has become my salvation. This song was written just after the Exodus, a huge event in the life of Israel. And this was just one little verse out of that big psalm, but it talks about how God delivered them out of Egypt and set them free. But Psalms also have additional purposes. They touch our emotions. I think all of us have favorite songs, whether it's worship songs or just songs that we listen to. And there's something about songs that stir the deepest emotions that just words often can't do. They also unite our hearts and minds. When we're here singing, we all focused on entering the presence of God. And so this last verse here in Revelations kind of gives that picture of the worship before the throne of God. And it says, the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they sang a new song. So guess what? We're going to get a new song. So this is, again, just that place of worship. And this is the very last book in the Bible. So songs, worship have been part of old history and part of our history throughout the ages. And the fact that Psalms does unite us might be the reason that Paul in the epistles encouraged the New Testament church to sing psalms. These are a couple of the verses. In Ephesians 5, speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing and make music in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything. And then in Colossians, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly as you teach and admonish. Again, psalms are used for teaching and admonishing one another with all wisdom as you sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts. So these are the various ways in which the Old Testament was used. But there's additional ways in which the Psalms influenced the New Testament church. First of all, many of the Psalms influenced the thinking and the theology of the apostles, as well as the worship of the early church. The New Testament writers often used the psalms for their greetings in their writings, as well as for doxology. The book of Psalms is the most frequently quoted in the New Testament. In fact, it is quoted 93 times by both the apostles as well as Jesus as proof that the messianic psalms that we talked about earlier, that this Jesus is the one that was talked about, that was prophesied about in the Psalms. Moving forward, many of our worship songs are based on Psalms. We're going to sing one after the service that's based on Psalm 84. But even some of the Psalms this morning were based on the Psalms, the praises. So this is the way that in this great big story that we've been talking about, the Old Testament is connected with the New Testament. However, there's two distinct ways in which our prayer and worship tends to be very different from both Old Testament and probably even New Testament. And I'd like to highlight those two and really spend the rest of our time this morning talking about those two differences and try to understand why is our prayer and worship maybe different. So the first point is that we don't tend to include lamenting in our worship. We sing about the praises of God, so that's the one. And then the second one is that even though we tend to really draw upon the Psalms a lot for a prayer, when we're really praying to God, we don't tend to pray the raw emotion, that the total honesty that the Psalms expressed. I noticed when Heather was reading that last verse that I put in there very intentionally about hate. We all kind of, went like that. We're uncomfortable with that, aren't we? So we'll look at maybe why that might be. To do that, I need to go all the way back to the very beginning of our series and the beginning of the Bible, the creation. As we heard from the very beginning, God's intention, his heart's desire when he first created us was to have this beautiful word that we heard, shalom. It's a peace, a rest, a connectedness with his creation. I'm going to use the word intimacy. He wanted an intimate relationship with his creation. And to me, the most devastating effect that the fall or sin has had on all mankind is the fact that that intimacy was broken, that deep connection with God was broken and lost. So it wasn't just the physical death and decay, but the death of that intimate relationship that God intended for us to have from the very beginning. I'd like us to look at the meaning of intimacy, because I think it's really critical for us to understand what God intended. The word comes from the Latin intimus, innermost, from within, closely acquainted, familiar, faithful, devoted, having or being in a very close friendship, confidential, and secret. Interesting words. Notice they all are words that describe the emotional, the heart, the relational context, not the physical. That's one way I believe that sin has distorted our understanding of intimacy. We tend to relate it to the physical, don't we? But God's intention was for the emotional, the soul intimacy. Maybe another way to put it is that in intimate relationships, we can be totally honest, like the psalmists were, without fear of rejection or retribution, being totally honest. When I thought about this meaning, the words of 1 Corinthians 13 came to mind, which really describes love. And it's almost like you could put the word intimate. Love and intimacy is patient, is kind. It does not boast. It is not proud, not rude, not self-seeking. It is forgiving, not easily angered, protecting, hopeful, and persevering. That's what love is, and that is what an intimate relationship looks like. But as you can tell from that description, we often really, really struggle with intimacy in our relationships, don't we, as a result of the fall. For many of us, instead of intimacy, we've experienced pain, abuse, all the opposites. In fact, we don't fully even understand, as God intended, what intimacy means. And we've become to fear it. Like Adam and Eve, as soon as that intimate relationship was broken through their disobedience, they covered up, they hid from God. And I believe that's often what we do with each other and certainly with God. We're afraid because we don't understand his intimate love. So this kind of brings me to the first point. The fact that we don't understand intimacy and are afraid of it, how does that affect our worship? Why is it that we tend to not include lamentations or lamenting in our worship? Well, first of all, let's face it, the Psalms were written a lot about what Israel went through and what David went through. Well, we aren't being pursued by a king that's trying to kill us, as well as we weren't enslaved. So off the top, that could be part of it. But I think there's a more real reason for us. And that is because of the brokenness of our lives. We do have a lot of pain. We struggle in just about every relationship, don't we? Why is there so much divorce? Why are families falling apart? Why is there so much hatred in our world, in our society? So we do live with a lot of pain, the physical, the emotional. And we want to escape our pain. So we come to church. We look for our sanctuary, the sanctuary, that shalom, that place of peace, of rest, of comfort, of connectedness. And so the last thing we want to do is think about pain. So we tend to want to sing songs that lift us up. We want to sing songs about our mighty God who is merciful, who is in control, who is forgiving, who is gracious, who is all-powerful. And there's nothing wrong with that, is there? We do need that place of comfort, of hope. And so worship helps us to be lifted up into the presence of God. The downside to that is that we tend to not be open and honest. We come to church not wanting to show how hurt we are, maybe. Our lives might be falling apart throughout the week, but we're going to, when asked, how are you, says, oh, fine, and we put our smile on. We're hiding, just like Adam and Eve. So that's one reason that we do not include lamenting in our worship. But I think there's a more devastating effect to the fact that we don't understand and experience intimacy, and that is how it affects our prayer life. The Psalms, if you're familiar with them, speak of every human experience and heartache that any one of us can experience. They talk about feeling forsaken, betrayed, brokenhearted, despairing, grievous, jealousy, doubt, fear, hate, and anger, as well as joy, praise, and gratitude. So all the things that we feel. Psalm 22 is one that we tend to be very familiar with. And it is one of the messianic prayers that actually Jesus quoted a verse from it when he was hanging on the cross. And I want to take a minute to pause there, because I think this speaks of the intimacy that God intended to have and that we don't have. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, he quoted a verse that is probably the lamentation of laments. Now remember, Jesus had experienced connectedness, intimacy in his relationship with the Father throughout his whole life, his eternal life. This is the one and only time when he's hanging on the cross, taking upon himself our sin, my sin, the sin of the world, that he felt the separation from the Father, that Abba Father that he knew. And in that place of hurt and woundedness, of separation, he did not pray, Father, take me down from this cross. He did not pray, stop these mockers from spitting at me and cursing me. Stop these thieves from being the way they are. He did not ask any of that. What he cried out was the cry of his heart, of his soul at that moment. My God, why have you forsaken me? He felt forsaken, like we often do when we're in those dark places. He knew his Father in the intimate way. But many of us don't really know our Heavenly Father in that same way. In fact, many of us have grown up in church being taught, especially if we've been Christians a long time, being taught about our mighty God who is all-powerful and who knows us very well. And so we're taught that we need to pray a certain way or have a certain attitude in order to approach him. After all, God is holy, and I'm not, and I can't approach him when I'm not holy. Certainly, I grew up pretty much my whole Christian life the same way. How many of us heard the term or heard it said that God desires intimacy with us? Any of us? I know I didn't. 30 years being a Christian did what probably many of you did. Reading Bible, going to church faithfully, praying, seeing many prayers answered, serving God in various ways. But not once did I hear the words that God desires an intimate relationship. And let's go back to that meaning, that description, an intimate relationship. And it wasn't until I had been a Christian 30 years that I had an encounter. I'm just going to briefly share it, an experience with God that turned my whole Christian life around. I was in a very dark place. Details don't matter. I felt like the psalmist described in one of the psalms, in this deep pit. Any of you can relate? It just felt dark. I felt like no one understood and knew what was going on. I wasn't able to really share. I kept crying out to God, but felt like God wasn't hearing me. All I kept hearing him say was, "Be still and know that I am God." Well, I got tired of hearing that, let's be honest. I was getting angry because I wanted resolution. I wanted answers. I wanted light and direction. And it was on one of my many walks. Those that know me well know that that's when I talked to God. And it was one of my many walks that all of a sudden I heard Jesus and experienced him right there with me saying, Maria, I understand. And all went still. And I all of a sudden realized that the God that I had been worshiping, that I know knows all about me and knows my circumstances, knows my heart. He really understands. And that's very different. I knew for the first time that God truly did know and care deeply, like Psalm 139 said. He did not only make me, he does not only know facts about my life, but he knew me intimately. And beyond that, he wanted me to know him intimately, not just facts about him, like we get to know about God, but he desires to know his heart, that intimate secret place and secret knowledge. And so that began a walk between him and I and Jesus, where I started really trying to tune in and listen to that still small voice. The Psalms are one place that we can learn that intimacy because they are so open and honest. And the psalmist had, I believe, that kind of open and honest relationship. But there's actually other places in the New Testament that also talk about God's heart desire for intimacy. The one is in John 15, and this is Jesus talking to his disciples just prior to, at the Last Supper, prior to his crucifixion. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friend, an intimate connection. For everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. Do we catch that? Jesus gave and wants to give us the intimate knowledge of the Father's heart. Then in Galatians 4, verse 5 through 7, and this is Paul writing to the church in Galatia, God sent his Son to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. Because you are sons and daughters, God sent the Spirit of his Son that into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. Abba is our word for it is daddy. It's a very intimate description. So the same intimacy that Jesus had and has is what we have been given now through him. Do we realize that? Through Christ, that division, that separation has been resolved. We are reunited with him. That's something that blows my mind, that we can have that same intimacy that Jesus had and know the Father the same way that he knew him. So again, the Psalms can teach us a lot. The Psalms can be like an open invitation from the Father's heart to your heart, to be open, to be honest, to receive in fullness the love and the mercy and the grace of his presence, and for us to learn the deepest secrets. Is that neat or what? We can know the deepest secrets of the Father's heart. But it takes listening. It takes being still, just like in our relationships here. It doesn't just drop in our laps. It takes an intentional being attentive and quiet and still before God. So, and the Psalms also can give us a model or a way of really starting to maybe learn. If we've had struggle, or if we struggle with being totally open and honest, especially in our prayer life, maybe I encourage you to take a psalm and maybe the one that fits you the best in your circumstance right now, and pray it, personalize it, put I in there, and try to really feel your emotions and what the Psalms are saying, and make that a prayer. The cross of Christ, as I said earlier, was the way, cross and resurrection, was the way that Jesus reconnected us. He endured the cross in order to complete and fulfill what the Father had intended for us from the very beginning, that intimate relationship. Hebrews gives us a beautiful image of that. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold, supposed to be D, firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize or understand with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, and I'd add boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So let us approach the throne of grace through our worship, through our prayer. And what I'd like to encourage also, along with approaching the throne of grace boldly in prayer, is when you worship, it helps me to actually visualize that I am before the throne of God, worshiping the Lamb who was slain, like in Revelations, and sing a love song to him. He's worthy of it. I hope that this has helped you to maybe better understand what intimacy God intended. Not just to understand it, but to know that that's the gift he has given us, and that you're encouraged to try to walk in that in a new way. Let's close in prayer. Abba, Father, what a privilege it is that we can come before you and call you that. No longer are we separated. No longer are we slaves. But we are your children, who you created and have loved unconditionally, eternally. Thank you that you have made it known to us through the scriptures and through your Son, Jesus Christ, that you desire this kind of an intimate relationship with us. Help us to become more open and honest with you as well as with one another, to come before you with boldness and thanksgiving, because you are a loving, merciful, forgiving, gracious God. And Lord, what a true blessing it is when we, mere mortals, yes, even in our sinfulness, can approach you, and that we can have an intimate relationship. Because intimacy is not about being perfect, which is often what we think. We have to be perfect with one another and with you in order to approach and be close. But Lord, that is not what you intended. You desire us to come in every state that we are, at all times. So thank you. Help us to remember this wherever we are, whether we're in a joyous place or in that pit that feels very alone and forsaken, to cry out to you. We ask this in the precious name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.